Hi everyone. Welcome to the Evangelism Formation Lab, or welcome back if you've checked out one of our other videos. This is the digital portal for Virginia Theological Seminary to reach out to all of our networks, to the Formation Network, to our strong alumni network across the country and across the world, in an attempt to offer resources to those of you who want to form your Christian lives in such a way that your lives form Christian lives. That's why we call it Evangelism Formation. But at this particular moment, we find ourselves in a bit of a perilous situation in the church. And it is this. States are starting to loosen their restrictions about how often or how many people can meet in public. So every single faith community across the country, no matter what's happening in your state, has to start to discern how you're going to respond to these new freedoms that we have to gather together. Through our networks at VTS, both in formation and talking to lay leaders and wardens and deacons and priests, and to bishops, we have heard people and their anguish over this particular question of how it is to respond to loosening restrictions about meeting. What is safe? What about singing? But what about our choirs? What about your music director? How do we do this? The truth is we found ourselves in what personally I would call a moment that is irreducibly about Christian ethics. There are all kinds of dimensions of the decisions we have to make now about how often to have Eucharist or whether to have Eucharist, and we have to go deep into our Eucharistic theology for questions like that, or whether or not we baptize people, so we have to go deep into our baptismal identity. But this particular question of how to gather in public, I believe is just an irreducibly ethical question. Thank goodness our tradition has great resources in moral theology. But we have to lean into our baptismal identity. We have to lean into our identity as people of word and sacrament as we meet this particular ethical question. And the reason we're talking about this here in the Evangelism Formation Lab is because every question of public witness is a question of evangelism. How we answer this question, how faith communities, how two or more people, not even large communities, how two or more people gather in the world will itself be a sermon to the world, a statement of what we believe. Where is our hope? Where is our love? Where is the person of Jesus Christ in everything through whom we live and move and have our being as communities? So this moment of discernment about how to meet is also a moment of evangelism. So that's why we're trying to offer some resources. So what we have for you today is a story some of you may have heard about a town in England in the 1600s. We can dip into church history at this particular moment to find this story about a community that was facing a plague that was killing people at alarming rates. It was an exponentially growing plague in London, and there was a threat that it was going to engulf most of the country. And there's a particular village with a faith community, an Anglican community, one church, and they made a group of decisions that I think have wisdom for us now. Spoiler alert about this particular story is there's no easy answer in it. But we're silly to sort of move forward blind as if the church hasn't faced plague before, and the irreducible ethical questions about how we gather, and what that says to the world about what we believe and who we are. So let's take a brief look at this story about life and discernment in a rural village. And because that's where it happened in the 17th century, we've decided to film here in a rural village. I hope God speaks to you in this story. In fact, I hope God speaks to you now and always. The offering that we have for you today is a story from the 17th century, a small village in the north of England called Eyam. For those of you that remember from church history, in 1662 there was something decreed called the Act of Uniformity. And it established the new prayer book from 1662, and it also was a bit of a rebuke to the more Puritan, Oliver Cromwell type people. In fact, in just a short period of time after the Act of Uniformity was established, over 2,000 clergy were essentially removed from their posts, being loyal to what had come before. Now, when we go to the village of Eyam, what you'll hear is that 2 or 3 years after this divide, in 1665, they had a new rector, and his name was Father Mompesson. But what you should also know, and this is very similar to other villages throughout England, the exiled rector was living just out on the edge of the village, and about half of Eyam was still loyal to his leadership, and about half to the new Reverend Mompesson. Now, the sad but ultimately, I believe, instructive tale of what happened in Eyam begins in September of 1665. The village was very excited that month because that is when they had their patronal feast for the parish church in town. And what they received in September was a bundle of fine fabrics from London. And an assistant to the tailor received the fabrics, and they were a bit damp from the journey, so he hung them up by the hearth, is what letters and diaries of the time tell us. And sadly, that assistant died the next day. It turns out there were fleas in that fabric that were infested with the plague that was ravaging the city of London. There really hadn't been an outbreak in the north of England yet. And a day later, the tailor and his wife, who lived in the same house, they were both dead. And what began was this slow wave of death through the village all through the winter. And by the spring, 40 or 45 people had already died in a village of just a few hundred. And it became very clear to the rector that this was an exponential growth of the plague. So the rector knew that the village needed some kind of plan. People hadn't begun to flood the village yet. So according to his diaries, he prayed earnestly and then made a very interesting decision. Rather than consult with other people in his church, he went out to the exiled rector living at the edge of the village, and he sat down and prayed with him. Now, the new rector knew that about half the village would never really listen to anything he asked them to do, especially if it was something that required sacrifice. So he had this great insight to go and find the former rector. And they talked together and they prayed together, and they came up with the idea of inviting, in fact, asking the entire village to quarantine itself, knowing that the plague would continue to spread through their village, but that they felt called by God, say the journals and diary entries of the time, called by God to absorb that death, the threat of certain death, knowing that they might be able to contain the plague in that part of the country. They basically said to themselves, how do we love our neighbor? If our neighbor is someone outside our village, what if our neighbors are the whole county or that whole part of their country? So then the current rector and the former rector went to the people. At that point, when they were meeting, it was always outside, and there were even paintings done of the time that show that they were kind of social distancing in Eyam before it was cool. And you see just groups of families that would gather in large fields, and the rector and the former rector would climb up on perches and communicate with the people. And they communicated to them the plan, which is what they would do is self-quarantine the village and ask that no one, no matter how much death, that no one leave the village. And remarkably, the people agreed. So what the people of the village did is they created a boundary line around the entire village. And they didn't build fences or walls or anything like that. But every 100 yards or so, they had these boundary stones. And together they would mark a sort of cordon around the entire village. And you can see these stones to this day. And what's interesting about these stones, if you get up close to them, you see that there are holes that are bored into them, because the rector continued to read up during the quarantine period on different ways the plague could be spread or could escape their village. And one of the things that he learned along the way, lifelong learning, is that coins could actually transmit the disease. So they would take vinegar and pour them into these holes in the boundary stones. And people from outside the village that were delivering provisions during their quarantine period would leave their objects there and then take the money, and they would have the exchange of commerce in a way that didn't transmit the disease. You may ask yourself, how long did this go on for? Well, the truth is the death continued to ravage Eyam, but people didn't leave. There's even a story of one woman who buried 6 of her children in 1 week, and then her husband died at the end of that week. And because people knew the plague could be transmitted even through dead bodies, anytime someone died in your family, you literally had to take them yourself and bury them either in your yard or somewhere in the village. And there are paintings and etchings of this period of villagers watching at a distance as they would watch other people they knew so well dragging their dead and burying them alone. What we read tells us that there were no public religious ceremonies or sacraments that went on at all. And for how long? It took 14 months. And at the end of 14 months, over 260 people who lived in this village from 73 different families, and in some cases entire families, were wiped out. But after about 14 months, the disease stopped spreading in Eyam. And historians to this day credit this small village with stopping the disease that was ravaging the city of London from ever coming to the north of England. And And yet one of the things about this story that moves me the most is to picture these boundary stones spread all around the village, that if you go there to this day, you can still see them, is that in between them, there were no walls. There were no fences. It was the vow of the community to see this challenge as an opportunity, as a call to live out their baptismal promises, their discipleship of Jesus, who said, love your neighbor. And who is your neighbor? Maybe a Samaritan. They loved people they'd never met by trying to keep the virus where they were. And in between these boundary stones was just heather and grass. The point being that at any moment, anyone could leave. But their vows were more important than a wall or a fence, and they would not cross those vows. There's a stained glass window in the parish church, you can go see it to this day, that memorializes both the rector and the story that we've just told here today. If you look carefully at this stained glass window, you see in the center of it is the rector, but then in a series of pictures that go clockwise from the lower left to the lower right, you begin to see the story depicted. In that first window, you see the delivery, the fabric arriving from London that begins the horrible 14 months. And then above that, you see the death inside the home of the tailor. But then look at the third window when you turn to the right. There you see the meeting of the former rector and the new rector, knowing that they needed to meet together and pray together and find unity in their faith. And then the last window represents two people in love separated by the gulf that was the boundary of Eyam and the rest of the world. There are so many lessons to take out of this story, and I'm going to trust that you, in prayer with the Holy Spirit, can find what the lessons are for our church right now and what we face in this COVID-19 pandemic. One of the lessons I take away from this is that part of the memorialization window that has the two rectors sitting together, the current rector and the former rector. And in their bodies, they represented a huge divide in the church of the time. The role of sacraments, the role of bishops, the role of prayer, the role of the laity. And this is what we know from reading their own letters and diaries. Neither one of them ever ceased to be committed to their deepest convictions in faith. But what they agreed to do for the good of others, to love their neighbor, was to let their personal commitments go deeper in their own lives, to sort of shore them up to be able to do such a hard thing. And they made a commitment to stay in communion with one another. So what I'm saying is, from what we read, there wasn't one theological view that won. There was instead people who decided to hold tight to their convictions, perhaps tighter than ever, so that they could do the hardest thing they'd ever been asked to do, which is to be willing to bury members of their own family or walk into death themselves to love the rest of their country. Any of you who are watching television or following on the internet know that within the Episcopal Church, we have people right now having heartfelt and important debates about the role of the Eucharist or baptism or pastoral offices or how we worship together. But we offer this story to you to sort of generate perhaps some new ideas. And in the communion of saints, give you people to whom you can pray and seek guidance. There have been people that have faced something that we're facing now. The questions, many of them were similar. How do we worship God in this time of the pandemic? Do we worship inside or outside? Do we continue to have the Eucharist? Do we not? I don't think there are any easy answers for us, nor are there any to be found in the tale of Eyam. But what it inspires me is to see people who clearly had a kind of village that was really split in half around bishops and Eucharist and prayer, in a time where a lot of Europe was separated on those same lines. And yet, in prayer, following Christ, they found a way to be committed to the abundant life that Christ has for the world, and that they would do anything they could do to preserve life in as far out of the world as they could by staying as close in with one another and learning to live together with their differences. And here we are, how many centuries later, telling the story of their witness to the world. My friends, we are praying for all of you, trying to make the hard decisions about liturgy and worship in community in the middle of these pandemic times. This seminary is praying for you, and we will do everything going forward to continue to offer you resources for your spirit, knowing that just like the cloud led the people out of slavery to the promised land, that Christ will lead us from the tomb of our time into the resurrection.